Hey everyone, so I'm going to share some blood test results, just showing what I view as some progress that I'm making. But before I get to that, I just want to kind of give a history of the type of insulin that I used to take and how much, and compared to what I'm doing now. Like I've said in my previous video, I've had type 1 diabetes for 27 years, and prior to about 5 years ago, the type of insulin I was taking for the majority of my time with type 1 diabetes was Lantus for the basal insulin. I would take a shot, usually around 20 units every night. And then for my bolus for my meals, I would take Novolog insulin. It would be on average, I don't know, around ten units per meal, depending on what I ate. So in total, I would, on average, take around 50 units a day. I was never really much of a carb counter. I just kind of my gut feeling as far as how much insulin I needed to take. So I don't know how many carbs I had on average. I would say somewhere between 200 and 300, but and so of course if I had heavier carb days, I would have to take more, but on average it would be around 50 units of insulin. Now, what I'm doing now is completely different. About 5 years ago, I stopped taking that type of insulin and I started taking Novolin R insulin. And that insulin it's a little harder to manage your blood sugar with it because it doesn't start acting or start working until 30 minutes after you take it. And it's like a slow peak. It peaks between 2 and 5 hours. So it's almost like a mix between an insulin you would take for, a bolus type insulin compared to basal. And that's really all I take now. The reason for that is one, I honestly going to the doctor was a hassle for me. I never really got anything out of it. The only reason I ever went to endocrinologist or any sort of doctor before was just to get a prescription for my insulin. Novolin R, you don't need a prescription. You just pick it up at Walmart and it's pretty cheap. So that's one of the reasons. And obviously, you know, at that point in time, like, it wasn't quite 5 years ago, but almost, or a little less than 5 years ago, there was, something going on as far as not being able to freely go anywhere. So that kind of sealed the deal for me as far as not really going back to the doctor anymore. So that's really so I haven't been to a doctor in 6 years, and I just, any blood test. The blood tests that I'm showing now are just kind of do it yourself. I sign up for some blood work online and just head into a lab and get my blood taken. Anyway, so going back to what I take now, and as far as the amount of insulin I take, I when I started with Novolin R, I was on a very, very low carb diet. And so it worked for that diet at the time, as far as it's not an immediate working insulin. And so, it would line up. It was kind of a high protein diet that I would eat at the time. Now I've introduced carbs back in. I think I did a very low carb diet for probably a couple years back in 2020 and 2021. But I've introduced carbs back in for a while now. And I would say I'm still around, I'd say on average around 200 carbs. It's not like huge, there'll be times where I'll remove them for maybe a week or however. I'll go through phases as being a little bit lower on carbs, just to kind of balance some things out. But on average, I'd say I could get up to maybe 200 grams of carbs, on average. And with that, on average, as far as how much insulin I'm taking, I'm now only taking 30 units compared to 50 before. And there are times where, just very sporadic times, like a 3 to 4 day window, where randomly the amount of insulin I need to take is very, very low. And I've never been able to get that low before, ever. For example, there's a couple days in a row where I'm eating around 200 carbs, maybe a little over, and I'm only taking around 10 units of insulin for that, and my blood sugar is fine. So that's, things that I see just on a daily basis, not every day, of course. It's happened maybe 30 times over the past 6 months or so. that I've been tracking it. So it's really weird that it occurs and then it kind of goes back to normal, at least my current normal of taking roughly closer to 30 units every day. So that's interesting. And another thing is fasting. So my first prolonged fast ever was back in October 2019, and that's kind of what started this journey into learning how to heal myself here. And that fast lasted 9 days. It was just a water fast, and I had to take insulin during that entire period, even though I wasn't eating anything. Even the last couple days of that fast, I was still taking. I don't remember honestly offhand, but I am pretty sure it was still close to 5 units in total for the last couple of days. Compare that to a fast I just a fast I did about 8 months ago in November. I did an 11-day water fast, November 1st through November 11th, and I only had to take insulin for the first 3 days of that fast. Days 4 through 11, no insulin at all, and my blood sugar, for the most part, or not just for the most part, pretty much the entire time stayed under 100. There's only one time, I think, on day like 5 or 6 where I joined a Zoom meeting, and my with social anxiety, my kind of my stress went up a little bit, and it kind of affects your cortisol levels, and that impacts blood sugar. So at that after that meeting, my blood sugar went up to around like 120-ish or so, but then just a few hours later, it was back down to under 100. So in my mind, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because when I do show the blood test results, I'll reference this as far as why I think I've had improvement in correlation with what I see in the blood test results. So, with all that said, let's get into the test results. So this first test here is just it was just an at-home test where I pricked my finger and put it on a card and then mailed it in. The main reason I did this is actually I thought it was a C-peptide test, but I was wrong. It just tests the insulin in my blood. It tests a few other things as you can see here, but the main reason I did it was just so I could get see if I have any insulin in my blood, and I did. Now, since it's an insulin test, it won't differentiate between any insulin you inject or the insulin that your pancreas produces. So you would have to take my word for it here that I didn't inject anything close to it. Now, what I did do, it was basically so that I was still taking, this was January 2023, so the insulin that I've been taking, like I said, was Novolin R insulin. I took my last injection 12 hours prior to doing this test. And Novolin R, from what I read, it's supposed to be out of your system within 8 hours, but possibly up to 12 hours. So the fact that I did it at exactly 12 hours, there could be remnants from that injection still in there. So this figure, whatever this even represents, 6.36, I don't know, but it's who knows, right? I can't really be positive that that's 100% insulin that my own body produced. But I'm in the range. It's a range. It gives a range of 1.9 to 23, whatever that is. I'm not too familiar with that. I think this test is mainly for purposes of testing solely to see. It's like a metabolic test. If you're um, at risk for type 2 diabetes, then and if your insulin would be high if you're doing a fast, which you're supposed to be when you're doing this test, and if you're outside of this range, basically it's essentially a test to see um, if it's high, then there should be maybe some cause for a concern. That said, I can't really say it's a good. I don't really don't know what this measure or this result really means because obviously you can see my blood sugar is high when I took this test. It was at 151. So, I would likely need more than the insulin that my body was producing there to not have it be that high. So who knows? So that was back in January of 2023. The next test, I did the same one, and this was in September. Now, for this one, I was fasting for 3 days at this point, and I had not taken any insulin for a full day and a half prior to doing this test, so 36 hours. So this one, I wanted to be sure that any injected insulin was completely out, and I wanted to see if I still had insulin in my system, which therefore could conclude that my pancreas is producing insulin. And yes, I did. It's a little bit lower than the last test. It could be due because the last test maybe there was some injected insulin still floating around, or it could just be the fact that my blood sugar was lower. So obviously the insulin would end up being lower. But who knows? But that for me at least solidified the fact that my body is producing insulin in some degree. Okay, so now the next test, this was actually where I went into a lab, and this heard about this. I never got this test before, so I wanted to do it. It's the diabetes autoimmune profile test, where it tests for auto antibodies that I would say the majority of type 1 diabetics have. The first one here is insulin antibodies. That one confused me a little bit because I didn't know. I mean, those have more to do with insulin resistance, and type 1 diabetes isn't really related to insulin resistance for the most part. I mean, I'm not saying you can't be insulin resistant if you're type 1. You certainly can. You have just as good of a chance as anybody but normally it's due to a poor diet and things like that. In this case, though, it looks like there are antibodies that make it that really have nothing to do with diet and they could cause insulin resistance. But I'm not familiar with those. I, the test results for me came back negative, so I don't have that. Same with the second one, anti-GAD 65 antibodies. I looked that up, has something to do with how it interacts with GABA, but I didn't look too much into that since I'm negative with that. These last two though, IA-2 and the ZNT8, I think the IA-2 is the one, at least from what I read online, that is the one that is specific with the attack on your beta cells and killing your beta cells. And as you can see, I guess I'm very high. It says I'm over 120, whatever that unit of measurement is, and you're supposed to be less than 7.5. So that seems very high to me. So, oh well, darn. Then we have ZNT8 antibodies. I looked up, I can't remember the difference between the two, but they also related to attacking your beta cells, and I'm high with that as well. It doesn't seem quite as high. I'm close to at least that 15 or under range, but I'm still high with those. So going down here just kind of gives a type 1 diabetes interpretation. And it looks like it gives the percentages of people that have these auto antibodies that are type 1. I would think the percentages would be higher, but they're kind of a mix. The IA-2, the one that I'm very high in, it seems to have the highest percentage there with 72% of type 1 diabetics being positive. So that's interesting. This last comment, though, towards the bottom where it says less than 3% of type 2 diabetics have positive antibodies. So that's interesting. So that's definitely a good distinction. At least if you're type 1, you're likely to have at least one of these auto antibodies. But like I said, the insulin antibodies, that just seems different to me. And I feel like if you have that, I almost feel like it wouldn't be classified as type 1. It would be its own type of diabetes, whole completely different type. Type 1, I've it's always generally been accepted and known that it's due to no insulin production in your body, no or little to no. So yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so I got that test just to get that information. And at the same time, I did do a C-peptide test. So C-peptide is essentially a byproduct when your pancreas produces insulin. I don't necessarily, I don't know if I'm sure it's used for something, but it is just really for the most part just kind of a byproduct. So if you have C-peptide in your blood, it means that your pancreas produced insulin. So it's really the only legitimate test you can do to know that your body is actually producing its own insulin. And the range that is common for type 1 diabetics is pretty much 0 to zero point 0.2. And when I did this test, I was hoping to be out of that range because I was feeling like I was making progress already, but I was still at zero point 0.2. Now, I've never gotten this test before, so in my mind, I'm pretty sure I had to have been at 0, considering I've had type 1 diabetes for 27 years. And they say the longer you go with it, it's likely you pretty much lose all beta cells for the most part. Maybe not all of them, but you are very close to 0. And the other reason why I say that I think that I was at 0 is really just the change in my insulin requirements and what I said about fasting. So 5 years ago, when I did my first fast, I had to take insulin during that entire 9 days. The fast that I did, 11-day fast 6 months ago, I did not have to take any insulin after day 3 of that fast. So that for me proves that I'm producing more insulin now compared to what I was 5 years ago. So this zero point 0.2 level of C-peptide I have is more than what I had 5 years ago. So I'm taking it as I've increased my beta cell, my amount of beta cells and my insulin production over the past 5 years at least. So that's the way I look at it. And that's, just to stay positive there. So this was in October of 2023. Then I actually went back a couple months later, did another C peptide test. I added an A1C in there. A1C wasn't very good. Unfortunately, what I tend to do is test myself a lot. I tend to purposely take less insulin than I should just to see if I'll be okay. And it leads to high blood sugars, of course, and I really have to stop doing that. But that's at least my excuse for not having a great A1C here. I usually shoot for the high fives, but oh well. But anyways, the C-peptide test came back the same. I don't necessarily know what I don't know why I was just kind of excited to go back. And so it was a pretty tight window here, but it was still at point 0.2. At least it didn't go down. But the main one that I want to look at is I got one in April of this year, just a couple months ago. And this one, A1C improved a little bit. Don't really care about that, but I mean, I care, but it's just not really a main focus as far as healing the diabetes goes. But as you can see, my C peptide has increased to zero point 0.4. So I was very happy with that. And that kind of coincides with what I'm seeing just on the daily basis as far as my insulin requirements go. And I'm technically out of that range, I guess, that they give for type 1 diabetics to be zero point 0.2 and below. So that's something. And now I'm not saying that every type 1 diabetic, like I'm sure there's type 1 diabetics that could probably range between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.4 possibly. I'm not sure. And again, I'm just saying these numbers because these are the ranges that they provide. Technically, to be a non diabetic, you would have to get up to this reference interval they list here above 1.1. So I'm not there yet, obviously. And who knows, right? I don't have a base case. I don't. I've never gotten this test done before these tests. So maybe I've always ranged between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.4 my entire life with type 1 diabetes. I don't know. But like I said, from what I see about with what I'm taking as far as insulin goes, and the fasting experiences that I've had, I know I've made an improvement. So this coincides with that, and so I'm kind of keeping a positive outlook there. And I'll likely keep going back and getting this test maybe every 6 months or so, and I will continue to share my results as I get them. But so yeah, that's it. Let me know if anybody has anything they'd like to add or any questions. All right, thanks. Yeah.